You're listening to Thriving in Business and Life. This is Will Wilkinson.
And I'm Christopher Harding. We're going to pick up where we left off last week.
Where did we leave off? I mean, it's been a whole week.
It has. Fortunately, I took notes.
That's what we need to do at our age.
Yeah. Is that a bias, Will?
I think it is, but we're going to find out more about that.
Yeah, so we were talking last week about the virus of bias and how bias can kind of creep into our conversations, into our work cultures, even into our family culture, and kind of infect our thinking with limited thoughts about people because of certain characteristics they may have. It could be age, like we just demonstrated.
Right.
It could be race. It could be gender. It could be economic status. It could even be the bias that the marketing department has about the engineering department.
And most of this is unconscious, correct?
Yeah, it usually is. It's so unconscious that a lot of times these type of biases are referred to as assumed truths because, it's something that our unconscious picked up along the way.
And we can't remember when we got it, probably. It's installed itself like a virus does.
Yeah, exactly. And then it just pops up at the moment when it can be most effective at creating havoc or limiting our thinking.
The most destructive. We were blogging about this the other day, and I was getting to the end of the writing, and it occurred to me that some readers might think they didn't have any biases. So I put in the closing line, by the way, if you think you don't have any biases, that's a bias.
Yeah. Well, and I think that we mentioned this a little bit last week, that biases don't make us bad. They make us human. That right. Biases are a natural way the brain functions. It's the brain's way of doing shortcuts. And so a lot of these assumed truths that we pick up along the way operate as if they were true until we actually begin to question, wow, is what I'm thinking really true?
Yeah, I was thinking about this watching a game the other day, and I realized there's a lot of bias in sports. For instance, a person will support a team.
Right.
And they're biased for their team and against the other teams. But when you look at a team, it's made up of players that keep changing teams. So who are you really rooting for?
So let's take that one for a minute, because one of the characteristics or symptoms, you could say, that the virus of bias is active is an us versus them mentality. Now in sports, we kind of allow for that. It's hopefully friendly competition. But when LeBron James, for example, left Cleveland to go to Miami,
right.
He was considered no longer one of us. He was a traitor,
Exactly.
right? Even though when he was on the team, we loved him, right? Well, when he came back to Cleveland, again, he was a hero.
Right.
So, that's a real kind of I think an example everybody can see that LeBron James was still LeBron James, the same guy he was, but somehow when he traded sides, he was no longer worthy of our admiration.
Exactly. And what happened is he became the other, quote unquote.
Right.
And I'd like you to unpack this a little bit, because it's one of the main points we make in this chapter of our book. Through bias, we minimize, devalue, marginalize, and dehumanize the other. I mean, a graphic and horrible example of that in the news recently was this shooting in a bar where the shooter apparently called out, "Get out of my country," and then shot someone he thought didn't look like they belonged in his country. I think that's a sad but pretty telling example of this otherness thing.
Well, and it happens every day. I mean, things like that are so tragic that they really bring kind of the challenge of bias to the forefront. But think about it even in everyday activity. Who is the other in your world? Who is it that doesn't belong? And if we take a look at this even in, let's say, a workplace setting, who is the other? A lot of times it might be somebody up the line who we don't want to include because we think they're clueless. It might be somebody in another department. It might be somebody who we think is, nerdy, or if we're nerds, we think that, they're jocks. Whatever that other designation is.
Well, yeah, and it can be triggered by an event. Another point we make is that through bias, we minimize, devalue, marginalize, and dehumanize the other. So that's a critique that probably arises out of some specific event. I'm thinking of a graphic example. Some religions shun people. Or if you leave or if you break too many rules, you are officially shunned. So you're dehumanized, marginalized, and now excluded.
Right. Now, if you were to talk to some of those religions, I'm familiar with people in some, they would say, well, we do that in order for the person to realize they're wrong and come back. And as soon as they're ready to come back, we'll welcome them in, right?
Okay.
And
Kind of like blackmail.
But if you think about disciplining children, we give children timeouts. So I don't think people in those religions would characterize that as being dehumanizing. I think they would characterize it as an act of love. But if you look at, and this happens with every country, anytime a country goes to war with another, they start to talk about the other side as being less than human. That allows them the rationale to do horrific things.
It provides a justification necessary to act in ways that normally they would not act.
Right.
Yeah.
So again, what I'd really love us to do with this one, because is try to think of how it applies to me every day. If I'm upset at my neighbor, do I suddenly start to consider him or her as being somehow inferior or other in some way? Do I begin to talk about them behind their back?
Right, and it can even be subtle through simply dismissing what someone else has to say, or not even really seeing them, hardly even noticing they're there.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest ones actually is just walking away from somebody or tuning them out, as if what they had to say didn't matter. So one of the other ones is that whole thing you mentioned, another characteristic of the virus of bias is that we exclude people.
Right.
Or we undervalue them. We gave the example last week about the assistant, an administrative assistant in a room who said something and was ignored because it wasn't considered that she had anything valuable to say.
Right. Yeah, so her viewpoint was just excluded. And I think we made the point before that often there's really valuable information that can come from unlikely sources if it's welcomed. And that may mean simply taking the time to create a trusting environment so that someone who's a little more timid about offering, say, a different viewpoint feels safe to do that.
Right. One of the things, as you know, that we hear all the time from corporate leaders is they talk about they want an environment where it's safe to speak up.
Right.
And so when you and I and our colleagues go in and do assessments in organizations to try to find out what the issue is, a lot of times what people will say is, well, I don't feel safe to speak up because if I say the wrong thing, it could be a career-limiting move.
Yeah.
And so, you could say there's a bias built into their experience of the organization that it's not safe. Now, maybe that's based on a long history of it not being safe. Maybe it's based on one thing they saw. One
event that happened years ago and they retain the memory, the programming, the fear. It may not be the same situation.
Right. And so when we experience those kind of biases in our culture, whether it's our family or the community or a workplace, what we have to ask ourselves is, like you said, how do we regain the trust?
Right.
And part of that is by making sure that we are inclusive, that we invite people into the conversation, that when they say something, we actually lean into that conversation.
Well, and I think, too, it involves being really conscious about it. Like reminding ourselves that there's a tendency to act on biases, and so we become alert and vigilant when we do. The other side of this equation I'd love you to say a little more about is the halo effect.
Right.
I think we introduced this in a prior program. It's a great term. As I understand it, it's simply giving preferential treatment and attention to someone else that you favor.
Right, and as you said before, it's very often done at an unconscious level. I think we mentioned in the book sometimes it's the family, it's the son or daughter that seems to not be held accountable the same way others are. In the work environment, it could be somebody who has access to a manager or leader and seems to be subtly mentored and so on. And if you were to ask that leader, did they choose that person consciously? Often they'll say, well, no, why do you ask? And it'd be, well, you're spending a lot more time with them, giving them subtle opportunities, sharing things about coaching and, mentoring about how to succeed in the work environment that you're not sharing with others on the team.
Right.
Or you're sharing them with others on the team except this one person. What's up there?
Well, I have an embarrassing story to tell on myself.
Oh,
about
please
that.
do.
Yeah, right. Years ago, I was involved in a team, a multimedia production team, and we were examining a number of scripts and trying to decide which to move forward on. Well, one of them was mine, and we ended up picking that. Well, now, in retrospect, with the help of a woman on the team who had a script that we ignored, and I'm saying that deliberately, we ignored it, I realized there was a lot of bias going on. Particularly, it had escalated, as she pointed out, and bless her heart, she wasn't bitter about it, but she was very direct, had turned into an old boys network. So, and it was kind of gender related. There was a bunch of guys and a couple of women, and I got preferential treatment. I was very embarrassed about that when I saw it in retrospect, because if we had judged those two scripts on their merit, actually, I think we probably would have chosen hers instead of mine.
Well, and it's interesting. That's why a lot of organizations are taking names off from applications, or even sometimes white papers that are being considered, because they want them considered on their merit, not based on a name or a relationship or gender or anything else. So again, part of it is us being willing to see, am I possibly giving preferential treatment to someone? Because we all tend to do this. And that's the thing. Like you said, if we consider ourselves to be immune to the virus of bias, that's when we're most susceptible.
Well, right. And the other point you made the last week when we started this conversation was that biases are not bad.
Right.
They're not bad by nature. They can be destructive or constructive. So I'd love to get into that a little more, because it's so easy to make things black and white.
Well,
we don't want our listeners to get the impression we're saying we shouldn't have any biases. I mean, one example I use is when I'm driving. I have biases to filter out information that isn't relevant to my driving. Because if I took in all the data, I probably would be unable to drive. So I filter out what I don't need to drive safely. That's bias, and that's helpful, right?
Well, yeah, that's that reticular activating system we talked about is what governs what we pay attention to and what we don't. And so sometimes what it will do in a helpful way, like you said, is it filters out all the non-essential information so we can really focus. The challenge with that is when we're filtering out information that is essential from someone,
right?
Because we believe that on an unconscious level that person doesn't have value.
Yeah, and if it's the halo effect, back to what we were saying earlier, we can overlook inappropriate actions, ignore a lack of accountability, even questionable behavior. We can call that exceptions or a fluke. Someone else looking at it objectively may say, well, actually, that's a habit.
Yeah, there's a couple of little axioms, I guess you could say, not necessarily that they're 100% true, but they're good things to take a look at. Nothing is an isolated incident. It tends to be a pattern of behavior.
Right.
So if I see this happen once, I'm probably doing it in other ways and places that I haven't noticed yet. The other one is the result bears out my intent. Often my intent is unconscious. But if I take a look at that and say, wow, what part of me, what unconscious bias might be at play that led me to treat this one person preferentially or to exclude the other?
Well, my wife has an example of that, whereas she grew up in her family with, I think, five kids. She was the favorite. She was daddy's favorite. Well, she was even uncomfortable with that.
Yeah,
because the bias kind of set her apart from the other kids, and she didn't like that. She would have preferred them all to be equal.
Well, and a lot of times the person who is getting the halo effect is suffering kind of the displeasure of their colleagues. There's another element here that we want to cover. A lot of times people will say, oh, no, I don't have biases.
Right. Not me.
Some of the symptoms of that, we talked about is that I like everybody. I really don't have any problems with people. And, it may be true. Some people happen to be very amicable and so on, but I'm always encouraging people, is there anyone do you think might have a problem with you?
Well, yeah, and look outside your comfort group, that cozy zone of friends who give you all the feedback you want.
Right, yeah. Yeah, where you're having your own halo effect.
Right, like, how's your new film doing? Well, my mother loves it.
There's, you know what? It's interesting you mentioned that. Just a quick aside.
We're into asides. We like that.
I would ask my mother for her opinion anytime I was feeling particularly down.
You were guaranteed to get a stroke on your back.
She loved everything I do. She was convinced I was a genius, and she would reaffirm that to me. So I would go to her. I mean, clearly the halo effect, but there were times when I used it in the right time.
Well, and this is seen often in very poorly made decisions by leaders who gather around them a cabal of yes men and women who will agree with everything they say. Now they're, covering their own behinds. They're maybe looking for advancement. They don't want to upset the boss. But the result is a bias in the boss who has a viewpoint that's supported by others justifying his conviction. It may not be the truth at all, and often this happens in politics, certainly in business. We can look at the result of a significant decision and look at it and go, what were they thinking? How could they have got so off base? Well, and this is part of the reason why that could have happened.
Exactly. It's the phenomenon we call groupthink, where everybody who tends to think alike agrees, and that the bias that could get in the way there is somebody who disagrees is seen as the other, is seen as wrong.
And then they're kind of ostracized. We don't want to hear any more from you. Well, the extreme case is whistleblowers. When a whistleblower dares to speak up and expose the situation that is actually true and is important to be revealed, the response is often to fire him. Get rid of the messenger. Ignore the message and get rid of the messenger.
Yeah, and those are some of the challenges. The other aspect of pretending that we don't have the virus of bias, and we hear this sometimes, or maybe even all guilty of it in some way, is, I don't see color,
or gender,
or we're all the same. And I understand the sentiment there. Is they're wanting to see the commonalities, which is good. But there are differences that people have, and that different groups of people have a propensity for different experiences. And so for us to pretend that everyone's the same doesn't really solve it either. The real opportunity is, what are the differences that I see, and how can I learn to value those and utilize those effectively?
Yeah, and that exposes the bias in that belief. Everybody is the same. Well, actually, we're all different, and we should be looking for the differences, not just saying, I'm being generous and accepting everybody as the same. This is patently untrue. We're simplifying something that is really complex. What are the unique skills? What are the disabilities we may have that would actually contribute to what we do together? We're talking about teamwork. Whether it's in an organization, whether it's in a family, whenever we do something together with even one other person, I mean, you and I have this dynamic going on all the time. We're different. We're similar enough that we, can do similar things. We can work together well. But you have skills I don't have. You have experience I don't have. Same is true the other way. I do. And you and I respect each other's differences. We don't go, Chris and I are the same. We're different, but we've learned to leverage our differences, hopefully, to create something better than we can do on our own.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd have a lot less fun just talking by myself.
Me too.
I'm going to hang on a second. I'm going to put on my glasses here, because there's an unconscious bias that people who wear reading glasses are smarter.
Well, I noticed that right away. You were wearing them earlier when we were preparing for the show, and I thought, wow, has Chris somehow improved his IQ?
Yeah. Somehow the things I was saying just sounded better.
They did.
The one of the things I was going to share is we've talked about biases, and I want to share one that an experience that occurred for me that was really challenging, and that was I had actually just finished speaking at a conference on implicit bias. I was on my way to the airport. I was in a town that I wasn't familiar with, and so I was on my way to the airport. I pulled into a 7-Eleven to walk in and get some directions. It's about dusk, starting to get a little bit dark, and as I pull in, alongside of me pulls another car. Now, just a little bit of background. I grew up in a very mixed race, mixed culture neighborhood, and family who are mixed culture and race. So I've had a lot of exposure to different people, right? I mean, I've had enough direct experiences and friends of all walks of life to be able to maybe think that I'm immune to some of the unconscious or implicit biases that are embedded in our society. But alongside me pulls a young African-American guy, probably, mid to late 20s, something like that. Now, I see him out of the corner of my eye, and nothing in my conscious mind has any sense of alarm or anything like that. But my unconscious mind pulls up a file that says something entirely different. And before I can even think about it, my finger locks the door.
It was automatic.
Yeah, it was just
knee-jerk reaction.
Lock the door. And all of a sudden, it was just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that. Malcolm Gladwell calls that the blink effect, right? It happens before we can even blink, hardly. Well, I turn around and look at the guy in the car next to me and kind of look at him like, oh man, I'm sorry, that's embarrassing. Well, he
saw what you had done.
Oh yeah, he saw what I did, and he heard it. It's like that electric lock sound. All of a sudden, he looks at me with kind of mock fright and locks his door.
So he was joking with you.
Yeah, he was kind of like making fun of me a little bit, Yeah. And so I laughed and got out of the car, and he got out of the car, and I said, wow, I can't believe that just happened. It was just automatic. And he said, well, welcome to my world.
Right, because he lives with that all the time.
Yeah, that just by the fact of being black, being a young African-American guy, there's this embedded fear in our culture that has this automatic response. There's a wonderful book called Whistling Vivaldi, where this young African-American guy talks about that he moved into this one kind of upper-end neighborhood where he was going to go to college. He was a very well-studied student, had been given a scholarship based on his scholastic achievements. But he noticed when he walked down the street that people got nervous and kind of like moved away. He could see their tentative feelings and so on. So he began to, whenever he was out on the sidewalk, whistle Vivaldi, this classical music, because somehow then people would overcome their stereotype.
Well, actually, they were adding another bias to the one they had.
Right.
The bias that if somebody was whistling Vivaldi, they must be okay.
Well, he basically invoked the halo effect.
Exactly. Well, that's an interesting combination. I wanted to tie into something else here. This is a question that came in apparently by email. Well, what if your bias is correct? And that's very interesting. I've got an example of that. My wife and I have a great relationship, been together for 23 years. Partly it's great because we do talk about things. We don't bury stuff. One of the issues we've had over the years, and I know a lot of guys can relate to this, is time. I'm more particular about time. When I want to leave the house to go somewhere at 15 past 10, to me, for some strange reason, that means 15 past 10. Now, to my wife, it means something a little different. It's like, well, yeah, that's kind of an estimate.
Right.
But I'm in my flow and, I'll get there and I don't want to be stressed out. Actually, an equally valid point, except for me, more of a micromanager, I'm concerned about the guys on the other end. When I'm showing up, I don't want to be late. So we've wrestled with this for years. She's called me a micromanager and I've called her, too casual. Well, I finally figured out what to do about this bias. My bias is that my wife is less particular about timing than I am, and it happens to be true. So what I've done is I've set the kitchen clock, which is what we rely on to leave the house, 3 minutes early, or 3 minutes late. So when she looks at it, when it's 15 past 10, it's only 12 minutes past 10, but I know that and she doesn't. So the result is we don't talk about time anymore and we get to where we're going on time.
Well, that very creative, if you will.
You know what? It works.
Actually, there's a church that I attend that moves their clock back 5 minutes because then people actually get in, quote, on time.
Right.
Well, let's talk about this. So we're dealing with a couple of different things. One is your wife tends to operate on what's called polychronic time. What that means is time is elastic. It's not a fixed entity. You're operating on what's called monochronic time.
Which is better, of course. No bias there.
So when you start to look at how you manage those kind of differences, the bias would be that one is better than the other.
Right.
And there are certain instances that there's benefits to both. But let's take a little bit deeper look. The other thing is, let's say that part of my story about someone includes a bias that has them be less than I tend to devalue them because in my mind, this bias justifies my behavior. So there's two elements there. A bias, even if it's true, is still only a slice of the whole.
Right.
I'm not looking at the whole person. I'm not looking at their backstory. I'm not understanding why they're that way.
It's a snapshot.
Yeah, it's a snapshot. And so if I use that little piece that may be true to justify me doing something that's going to really diminish their value or how we utilize them, I'm not only cheating them, I'm cheating me, and I'm cheating us as a whole.
Right.
So even if there's part of the bias that's true, it may be a single instance. Don't generalize it across the entire group, and it's only part of the story.
Yeah, there is so much to explore here. I think we're going to need to do more shows on this.
Yeah, it's because it's something that's going on all the time.
Yeah, nonstop. Well, we'd like to leave our listeners with a little challenge, and I came up with one. And you and I didn't talk about this before, but it's in our book, and it's a fun one. Now, I'm going to use you as the guinea pig here, and you know the answer to this.
Oh, good.
So you got to pretend you don't.
All right.
But this is for our listeners. It's a little Zen challenge.
All right.
Imagine that there's a goose in a bottle. Okay. And it's one of those big glass bottles with the small necks. Your challenge is to get the goose out of the bottle. How do you do that? There's 3 rules. You can't kill the goose. You can't break the bottle in any way. And you've only got 30 seconds. So go.
Wow. Okay. Now we'll see whether am I actually going to pretend I don't know or whether I now forgot. So my bias could be, this is an impossible challenge. And I could give up saying it's not fair, there's no way for this to work, and all of those types of things are going to limit my thinking to where I can't come up with it.
Right, and I've asked people this over the years, and they've come up with so many imaginative ideas and really struggle to try and figure it out.
Well, and now that you say the word imaginative, I'm going to pretend that I know the answer. And you said imagine there's a goose in the bottle, so I'm just going to imagine that the goose is no longer in the bottle.
Bingo, bingo. The answer is simply there's a goose in a bottle. The goose is out of the bottle.
Right.
We're using our imagination. The bias here, and I wanted to leave listeners with this because it's kind of evocative, is that we take something imaginary and we make it real, and then we apply the rules that regulate reality towards an imaginary situation.
Wow. So you'd apply that to bias as if a bias, which most of the time, those unconscious implicit biases are imaginary rules we've made up. That's brilliant. I love that.
Well, it is, because we can relax. And I mean, if listeners can remember how they were struggling to figure this out, that's what we do in life. And it's unnecessary. I mean, this morning, the sun rose without me shoveling the darkness out of my room. Right? I didn't have to do that. And there's so many ways we make life more difficult for ourselves, misinterpreting and operating on the basis of unconscious bias.
Wow. That's great. Well, we'll leave it at that. This is our final minute here. So let me give you just a couple of surviving and thriving tips. So one is, if you're surviving, you're ignoring your vulnerability to bias as if somehow you were immune. If you're thriving, you're being consciously aware of your own vulnerability, inviting others to hold you accountable. So that's our thriving tip of the week.
Excellent. So this has been Will Wilkinson.
And I'm Christopher Harding with Thriving in Business and Life. And remember, you can send your questions or stories to thrivinginbusinessandlife@gmail.com.
And we'll talk to you next week.